Welcome back. I hope that you had a very safe and healthy spring break and that you're all doing well. Thanks for getting through the exam. Very tricky online, but we made it. You did great. And the best news is we're leaving statistics and the scientific method. And I'm sure many of you are really happy about that. I love the scientific method and I enjoy quantitative analysis and research. So that's what I'm teaching in the fall. If you would actually like to put together a survey, collect data, and analyze it, that's what we're going to be doing in that class. However, that may not be your cup of tea, so we are going to cover the two other ways of knowing that we've talked about thus far, and they are also your two other options for taking your methods class. Remember, you have to take one: quantitative ethnography, critical cultural, or conversation analysis. So we've talked about quantitative and the scientific method, and this week we are moving into ethnography. Totally different, but you've heard the word already before. Ethnography is qualitative, it is interviewing, and there are no statistics involved. So let's take a little bit more in-depth look at this word and term and what this research methodology involves. So this is basically, ethnography came out of the ethnomethodological tradition. It's a sociological tradition that aims to explain how members engage in social situations. This also came largely out of anthropology. You'll read that as well, because people want to look about how people go about making sense of people's behaviors. And so a lot of this anthropologically started because people wanted to make sense of why tribes live in certain ways, or why certain communities behave and communicate in such a way. And that's really where ethnography gets its roots. Ethnography is looking at things from the native point of view. I want to go inside and figure out why and how this group communicates and behaves in the way they do. I don't want to watch from outside. I actually want to go in and experience that. So you had a lot of anthropologists and early ethnographers who went and lived with tribes and tried to get that first-hand idea of what their life was like. And that's what we mean by that native's point of view. Someone who has experienced it, been through it, etc. And we'll talk more about that, because sometimes I think, until you've been through something, you can't possibly understand it or explain it. And that's the whole notion behind ethnography, is trying to dig deeper into that point of view, that story, that sense making of why people behave the way they do. I would really like to talk to the hoarders out there and try to understand why they bought all the toilet paper. Okay, I'm trying to be calm, but we have toilet paper in my household, but it was a little scary there for a little bit. We just recently got paper towels. But, there was actually, why are we so interested in ethnography? If you ever watched the show Hoarders, it's a lifestyle. And we are trying to make sense of why people do that and what propels them to act in that way. And we do that by going in and interviewing them and getting their point of view. So we do a lot of natural inquiry, is what we call it, naturalistic inquiry. It is the study of how people behave when they're absorbed in truly unique and genuine life experiences. I'll go back up to grounded theory, but this idea is, how does it feel to skydive? Actually, I don't know. I've never done it, believe it or not. I've jumped off a lot of things, but I've never skydived. And I might want to, one, experience that too, but talk to people right after they experience it and get their take on what that feels like. So we're often trying to get those genuine life experiences. It's the, you just won the Super Bowl, what do you want to do now? Go to Disneyland. What does that feel like? And oftentimes it can be very difficult to try to get a person to describe what that genuine life experience is in a way that we can relate. One of the ways we do this is through grounded theory. Basically, grounded theories say we develop theories by systematically gathering data. And remember, in ethnography, all data is gathered through primarily interviews, by absorbing yourself in that native's experience, interviewing people, observing behaviors, and we start to collect enough data about what we hear and what we observe that we start to develop theories. So while in scientific method we had hunches and we made hypotheses, we're still going to do that in ethnography, but our data is different. Our data, instead of being numbers, our data is actually going to be people's stories and our observations. Okay, there are two different types of ethnography. There's the ethnographers of speaking and the ethnographers of communication. Let me start with the ethnographers of speaking is actually the micro of the two. It's the smaller, more specific. And what it did is use a very specific formula to look at a specific community and group and their speech patterns. The ethnographers of communication look broadly at culture and society to try and make sense. So the ethnographers of speaking follows, again, ethnographers of speaking follows a very specific format, and we're going to take a look at that format. And it's looking at the communication of a very specialized community or group. So I actually put the Friends picture up here because maybe some of you are fans. I know a lot of you are also Harry Potter fans. And these are groups or communities that really had their own specialized way of making sense of the world. So I put them as examples. So the ethnography of speaking comes from Himes, and it says you have to look at these elements over here to understand. You need to look at the scene and the setting. And basically this is, where is this occurring and why? Interestingly enough, this coffee house in Friends was a huge part of the scene. And I do think it helped propel the coffee house culture. And we did not have the coffee house culture in the 1980s when I grew up. So certainly this became part of that way that we communicate now, is the coffee cup culture. We have to look at the participants here. We certainly have younger participants. They're all single, all of these kinds of things. What are the ends they're after? What is the act, the key, the instrumentalities, the norms, and the genre? Don't worry, I am going to define all of that for you. There's actually a great little chart that explains what all of these little pieces of ethnography of speaking that you need to have to appropriately study that specific group or specific community. I enjoy this. I have actually wanted to look at the ethnography of speaking in terms of colleges and how the setting of a college changes our communication. And I can look at all of these different elements to kind of come to some conclusion or make sense of behavior and communication in that community or setting. And we certainly do have unique words for that. Ethnography can take on two other forms, and we actually have courses in both of these. We say we have autoethnography. And autoethnography is your own, just like autobiography. Autoethnography basically is your story. So if you have a genuine life experience, something that you want to share, you can write your own autoethnography. And yes, these are publishable. We consider them a valid research. A lot of our students will write an autoethnography. I had a grad student who wrote an autoethnography about her time in prison and how that shaped her, and the communications and the behavior, and how she had to make sense of her world when she was serving time in prison. It was a very powerful piece, and that was simply her story. But a lot can be learned and gleaned from that. I had another student who wrote an autoethnography about his war experience, and certainly that was a powerful autoethnography of what he went through in war. We also can turn these stories into public performances, and we call this performance ethnography. And we actually have a class in performance communication. where we take these stories and then bring them back to life on stage to illustrate how those communities and individuals communicate and make sense. Um, I have a clip on here, and probably some of you have seen it. It's the closest I thought to just a short little clip of kind of the power of a public performance that engulfs one person's story. So I'll let you watch it.
There she was like a picture. There she was just the same. There she was, he just had to know, and she had forgot his name. Oolay, oolay, oh. Thinking back to the last time, on the wall as they turned away. Walking back, was it just a trick, or did he hear her say, oolay, oolay, oh. Tried his best to forget her, tried his best to just keep his stride. Kept his word, but he knows he heard. Oolay, oolay, oh. Oolay, oolay, oh. There she was like a picture. There she was just the same. There she was, he just had to know, she had not forgot his name. Oolay, oolay, oh. 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 There he was like his picture. There he was just the same. There he was, he could never know, she could never get his name. Oolay, oolay, oh. Thinking back to the last time, on the wall as they turned away. Turning back, did he even know, did he ever hear her say, oolay, oolay, oh. Trying her best to forget him, trying her best just to keep her stride. Oolay, oolay, oh. Oolay, oolay, oh. There they were like the picture. There they were just the same. There they were, but it was.
Okay, so pretty powerful, I think. I hope you agree. That is really the culmination of performance of art and even part of her story that wasn't expected. And you can see their whole relationship just kind of evolve right in that minute. He shakes his head a lot. He has a lot of remorse. She instantly smiles at the sight of him and starts crying. And, you know, the first time I saw it, I think I cried too. It elicits this genuine experience of the story of love and love lost. And it can also be performed in an artistic way. Okay, moving to the next slide, I hope. Boom. All right, so we do still have claims Remember I said hypothesis, research questions in interpretive. And I remember, I've got to go way back now in the semester when I was saying, what would a scientific claim sound like? What would an interpretive claim sound like? And you struggled with this a bit. An interpretive claim, remember, says it asks about a phenomenon. It asks about culture or how people share meaning. So it might, remember we said, what is the experience of a single mom right now? Particularly right now. This whole coronavirus and everything we're going through, there's going to be so many stories coming out, and there already are, as we look at people struggling and how are they dealing with it and how are they creating meaning. This is all, what was this experience like? And you're going to tell stories about this. You'll say, oh yes, that time we all had to move home, and that's where we make the claims, where we're asking more about how we experience a phenomenon, how we come to have a meaning. We call that system of shared meaning a web of significance. How do we become significant in terms of how we relate to each other, how we explain our behaviors, etc. So those are the kinds of claims. We're still asking questions. We're still going to do research. Remember, I said one of the interpretive project ideas I have is I would like to know about people's experience within the Catholic Church. Don't know if, yeah, I've mentioned that, I think, early on. And particularly those who have the experience who were raised very strictly Roman Catholic in the beginning, but eventually maybe left the church or religion altogether. That's a particular group I'd like to talk about how they make meaning of their lives based on those experiences. Okay. Sometimes we look for very specific speech communities, and that's a group that shares rules for using and interpreting speech. One group I always found fascinating to interview and talk to, believe it or not, is the speech and debate team. And the reason being is this is a very special group that has its own language and its own rules for sharing and talking. And it can be quite confusing if you go to a debate tournament and everyone's running around asking you, did you break? Did you break? Did you break? Break what? It's fascinating to interview and talk to debaters as well as speech performers because they have such a unique way of communicating information, and their rules for using language are different. And so we can look to that and see how do they make sense of that. Then there's the communal function of communication, which is, again, how do we create and confirm a shared identity? Gosh, there's so much going on right now that I can put to this. Even pictures that we've seen of people, wearing masks, or healthcare workers making hearts and holding up signs. How do we remember we're all alike in some way? How do we share that identity? And I think there are some instances right now where we're looking for ways to share and say, yeah, I'm going a little nutso at home too. I can share that experience with you. It sucks. This sucks. I would so much rather be in the classroom. It's so much easier and it just gives you a totally different energy. But we're here, and this is the identity we now have to share and communicate with each other, and that becomes different. We also have what we call code switching, mixing the rules of one speech community with the rules of another. And I often try to do this, and my son hates it because you have your own speech community as young adults, let me put it that way, and I have my speech community, which is old lady, okay? And I should not try to mix the two. My son would not like it if I tried to, he never has, when I try to use popular words or ask him about his bay back in the day, he'd just be like, Mom, stop that. I do remember one time he and I were driving somewhere and he saw one of his friends going by and he was like, oh, that's so-and-so, I wonder where they're going, he said to me, and I was like, yeah, what would they be doing here? And he said, oh, he's probably going to get lit. And I was like, what? What does that mean? And I know now, please, no need to inform me. I get it. And I'm still learning. I like to try and keep up on whatever your community or your code or your speech community as young adults is talking about. It's hard. because I'm not in that speech community and it's not the language I use. And so when I switch codes, I can look quite foolish. And so how do we switch codes so that we don't sound that way? Kevin is a very good code switcher, and I think many of you might be. He works, obviously I've told you, he works full time now as a mechanic. And mechanics have apparently a very unique speech community. And that speech community involves a lot of the F word. It also involves men. There, I don't think any female mechanics in any of the shops he's ever worked at. So it's definitely got a profane, masculine, but he doesn't use any of that when he comes home and sits down to dinner with us. And that ability to shut off and code switch back to family communication, I think, is just brilliant. A difficult thing to do. So these are the kinds of things that we, again, look at, study, and ask questions about. How easy is it for someone to code switch? And what does that look like? Again, we're still going to be asking questions. Most of the time, I skip the group 3 to 12. Most of the time when we do ask questions, we are usually asking 3 to 12 people. Remember, I said everything we do in qualitative research is much, much smaller. So if you had 15 or even 20 interviews, that would be a lot of data. You could get something published with only talking to 3 people who had that experience, and that's okay. We still count that as a valid piece of knowledge. Okay, again, sources of data for ethnography. Obviously, we can observe, but interviews are our key way of knowing here, and the use of any archival documents or artifacts. Don't get freaked out here because you can still use some artifacts for ethnography. So if I was sharing with you my time traveling, I love to travel. I've traveled a lot on my own. I went to India by myself, which was very fascinating and interesting. And if I kept a diary or a journal during that time, and you were interviewing me about my experiences traveling in India, you might also be, if I gave you access to my journal, that would be an archival document. Any pictures, artifacts. We actually almost hired a professor who, part of her studies was she was an ethnographer, a qualitative researcher in Nevada, researching women's life experiences in brothels. Now, before you go crazy, it's legal. Brothels are legal. I did my master's at the University of Nevada, Reno, and it was well known, where the brothel was. They're in the outskirts, more like Virginia City, not right in Reno. But certainly she did an ethnography, and she found most women, a lot of them were married. They went there for a few months. They made their 40 grand and then went back to their families. It was fascinating. She got what we call a key informant, which was one woman who was willing to talk to her and let her into the brothel. And that's often key because sometimes you can't get in certain communities. You can't get in, people won't let you come interview, etc. So she got a key informant. And soon other girls came forward and spoke with her as well about their experience. Completely fascinating, and probably something we really don't know that much about is this kind of legal sex trade. Again, fascinating, totally a way we do research, and it's valid. So, observation, interviews, even certain documents for ethnography. I want to talk a little bit about how we do an interview. I think most people think, yeah, you do an interview, you ask questions. Oh, if you've had a job interview, it's much more complicated than that. So you, as the ethnographer going in and doing the interviewing, you have to be particularly prepared. We actually say you want to think a lot about the interview setting. Where are you interviewing the person? It's a very good idea most of the time that you interview them on their ground. If you take nonverbal communication, you'll learn a lot about this. People feel much more comfortable in their own settings. So you should go to the person you're interviewing. Do not make them come to you. And if at all odds, don't meet in a public place. Usually you want somewhere private that is comfortable to the person you're interviewing. It's really quite critical to the process. And I do this even when I think about it when I have appointments with different faculty and what would be more comfortable. Should I go to their office? Should they come to mine? Who needs that comfort for the opening of communication to occur? Interviews should be structured to some degree. They can be fully structured. What do we mean by this? This means you go in with a fully structured interview guide. That's what we call it, an interview guide that has all the specific questions you want to ask already there. You've thought about them, you've put them all out, and a lot of times people will even send their interview questions ahead of time to a participant. That's actually something I've been asked to be interviewed, and a lot of times I'll turn people down and say no, because I don't know what they're going to ask me. I haven't seen the questions and I don't want to be caught off guard. So when you interview someone, you should give them some kind of guide, either fully structured with all the questions you want to ask or semi-structured. And semi is exactly what it means, only half structured, where maybe you have a few guiding questions, but you're going to leave the interview open so that if it takes a different course, you're willing to go in that direction. And you really have to think about what kinds of interviews you want. Is it something that you want to go in an open direction? Or do you want to make sure every single participant answers the same 6 questions? And the reason being is because you're looking for themes or commonalities of that shared experience. What kinds of questions can also be difficult? And some of you may say, I don't know what to ask when they always ask, do you have any questions? Well, there are 3 that I put here, obviously many, many more. And if you take a whole course in ethnography, you are going to spend a lot of time learning the ins and outs of how to properly interview someone. So a good one is a descriptive. We call it a grand tour question. So describe a day in the life of, your life as a restaurant server. Describe your typical afternoon. Describe how your typical morning starts. These are give me the tour of what do you go through. Structural questions. This can help you organize knowledge. What we mean by this is, so who do you answer to? Do you have a boss? How does the Army work in terms of rank and order? Because if you were interviewing a veteran, you might need to know some structural issues within that organization to kind of understand the context. So ask structural questions. And you can also do contrast questions. So how is this different from, or would this be similar to? And you start with these types of questions because they generally get at a deeper setting of what's going on. All right. We are going to end there for now. There is more, but we're going to pick that up on Wednesday. Where we're headed is I want to start looking at transcripts with you. So what happens once I do have an interview guide and I go and I get that interview? What do I do with it after that? How do I make meaning out of that interview? We're going to get into that a little bit more on Wednesday, and you will be looking at some interview transcripts and how we find meaning and context from interviews and what we can learn by what they tell us. So that's where we're headed. We are in the ethnography chapter. A lot of the terms are in there, and I will post this and we'll pick up on Wednesday.